that looks like a nice place to cycle. It'll be fine. Here we go with my attempt to summarise a brilliant week spent cycling in Italy this past September. So get ready for some awesome scenery, questionable commentary, and poor enunciation. What? Enunciation. When I got back from Alpe d'Huez in July, I was a bit lost in terms of cycling goals for the remainder of the year. Without any cycling trips on the horizon, and the unfortunate absence of European hill climb champs. I still found some enjoyment slotting in my typically weird hilly rides, and a few things fell into place that allowed me to plan this early September Italian holiday. You'll think that would provide a great incentive to get out training, but I actually found it quite difficult to get into the mindset and plan things out properly. Generally not the wisest idea, but as we'll see later, it actually worked out for the best. My dad was already in France, so I flew over there and spent a week there. Still working remotely, but was able to get out for some great rides, and it was nice to be reacquainted with the smoother roads and longer climbs that you don't get in the UK. On Sunday we drove over to our base for this holiday, which was in Predazzo. Well, actually partway up a mountain above Predazzo. As previously mentioned, I hadn't really planned any of my rides out properly, but there were 3 mountains I wanted to climb at some point. Zoncolan, Stelvio, and Grappa. Unfortunately they're not exactly close together, but we managed to find somewhere sort of in the middle, or at least at such a location that they were all within reach for a day trip. None of these 3 climbs are actually even in the Dolomites, which I didn't realise were just around the corner, until there they were. Prior to our trip, the weather in this region had been looking pretty good, but obviously my presence summons rain. I went out for a tiny post-travel spin and succeeded in getting everything absolutely soaked, and by the following morning it still had not stopped chucking it down. However, it wasn't looking quite so bad over by Stelvio, so we dubiously set off to BRAAAM Silfser. What a beautiful day! Thankfully things cleared up, but it was still looking a little suspicious up in the mountains, and I wasn't sure what awaited me higher up. After a terrible can't be bothered warm-up, I set off in my thinnest summer attire. So this is the ascent from Prad, which I think is the most iconic side, although the climb from Bormio is also very popular. The summit is at 2,757 meters, and with the climb starting at a little over 900 meters, you gain around 1,800. The general rule is that temperatures drop roughly 6 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 meters elevation gain, and it was around 17 degrees at the bottom, so yeah, best not to think about that one. The opening kilometers are very tame, not too much going on, just a nice steady gradient. Something that caught me by surprise was this bike path that runs alongside the road for the first few kilometers, which, like an obnoxious fool, I totally ignored. So Stelvio was a climb I'd always wanted to do, but never been overly excited about, mainly because of all the horror photos I've seen of huge traffic jams basically bringing the mountain to a standstill. Due to the severe weather coming with its high altitude, there's a relatively limited window the pass is open for throughout the year, so it can get pretty chaotic up here during peak time. Luckily today it didn't prove to be an issue at all, although you'll always get your share of sports cars out and about. But it transpired that I had other difficulties lying in wait. My plan was simply to ride the mountain hard, just kind of see how it went, but I definitely set out too hard because I was already in the red in this first half an hour. After 10 kilometers or so, the road narrows, and there's this section kind of in the trees. This whole area is actually Stelvio National Park.
Donkeys! Make sure you have your jellos. Gel.
It was right around here that I saw hairpin number 44 and started to get slightly concerned. There's 48 bends in total, but they count down, and 44 bends remaining is not a good sight to see when you're just starting to die. I managed to get hold of a gel on this flat section, but unfortunately there was this really steep kicker right afterwards, and things did not sit too well. The air was also getting thinner and temperatures were starting to drop.
Come on, Harley, you got this.
I can't breathe.
You'll be fine.
Of course, I was very lucky to have my dad driving up. Had I been setting out here alone, it definitely wouldn't be suitable to just be wearing shorts and jersey with nothing else. You often don't realise how cold it's getting as you're sweating uphill, but with a long descent, it wouldn't have been appropriate or safe to just head up there like that without support. So the summit starts to pop into view here. I remember I had around 300 meters of climbing left, and I looked up and it just looked so incredibly far away.
Go on, you can see the top up there. See it?
With the temperatures decreasing and maybe altitude kicking in a bit, along with having been riding pretty hard for about an hour, I started to really suffer. I stopped even thinking about getting a good time and just entered that kind of survival mode, just wanting to get to the top. It sounds really dramatic, but it turned into one of the hardest experiences I've had on a bike, which feels silly saying now because as soon as you get to the top you basically forget the pain that you experienced. But it was just really brutal trying to keep the legs pushing. Absolutely thrilled to reach that summit. Nearly crashed into that guy. Definitely not a perfect ride, and I underestimated Stelvio, but it was a really memorable battle experience, which is all you can ask for from a mountain. Most of all, I'm just super happy that I was able to ride it, as a few days later there was lots more snowfall and it wouldn't have been feasible. So that was day number 1, just a nice, easy, slightly traumatic opener. You might think I'd have learnt my lesson from underestimating Stelvio, but nah. Less than 24 hours later I was off embarking on the same fare, this time on Monte Zoncolan. In a similar fashion to Alpe d'Huez in my previous video, I came back to Zoncolan later on in this trip and had a better experience, so I'll save all the details for that section. But to quickly summarise, I sort of just jumped out of the car and tried to bash off it on really tired legs. It was way hotter than expected, in the high 20s, and I completely cooked myself before the climb had even officially begun. So the whole thing was just a really unpleasant ordeal. I was really disappointed because I'd been looking forward to Zoncolan so much, and it had all just kind of gone badly from the get-go. I vaguely penciled in the possibility of coming and giving it another go in a few days, but it would be hugely dependent on a number of factors, mainly of course the weather, which was about to get a whole lot worse. It was still ridiculously hard, and we had to leg it out of there to make it back in time for our pizza reservation. So that was Zoncolan Take 1. We'll be seeing you again shortly. After 2 days of very challenging exertions, I was looking forward to a slightly less intense day. I obviously wanted to ride some more hills and was thinking of just finding some out of Predazo, but I was having a scroll around the old Strava heat maps when I noticed that Passo Giau was not far away at all. I was really ignorant regarding the climbs in the Dolomites. I'd heard of the Cellar group but was under the impression that they were all just kind of short and shallow, but I really liked the look of this one. I started in Selva di Cador, and the climb from here is roughly 10 kilometers at 9%. It was a really nice starting base, but even after downing a cappuccino or two, I was procrastinating a bit because my legs were really just not feeling it. But the increasingly loud bells seemed to be signalling me to get a move on, so I eventually got going. It took a while to shake out the stiffness, so these first few kilometers probably felt the hardest of the whole climb. But the road surface was great, and it was fairly quiet, which made for an immediately enjoyable ascent. There are a few pitches along the way, but it's generally quite a consistent gradient. I think Giau is one of the steepest major Dolomiti climbs, although compared to Zoncolan, which my back was still in bits from, it felt nice and gradual. The hairpin markers, or tornante, actually count up, which isn't entirely helpful if you don't know how many there are. Although in some ways it's kind of nice to be oblivious, especially following the Stelvio experience. The scenery as you climb up higher is astounding. It almost felt like a scenic drive because you're just riding right by these immense rock formations that look almost man-made. As you can tell, this ride didn't exactly turn out to be very easy after all, but who cares? If it came to choosing the nicest climb I've ever done, Giau is a definite top contender, which is a bit absurd considering that it wasn't even really on my radar until a few hours earlier. I then descended to Pacol and climbed up Passo Valparolo before descending down to Capril. Absolutely awesome views the whole way around, and I definitely take back any reservations or snobbiness I had about the climbs around here. This was the only proper ride I did in the heart of the Dolomites, but it was incredible. So I keep banging on about the weather, and in these first 3 days alone we'd already experienced a whole range of conditions, and the region was due to be hit by a bit of a storm which would see a drastic drop in temperatures. Since we were located partway up a mountain, this would mean snowfall, and since we were staying in a mobile home without heating, this was looking to be pretty bad. So we did the only rational thing and fled to the lowlands of Lake Garda. Sounds like a great idea. It was forecast to be sunny and warm. It was not. I'd always wanted to come here and was surprised to discover that it's actually quite popular as a cycling destination. But I'm afraid you won't be seeing much of that from this video, as it was pretty grim and we mainly just experienced the tourism chaos up in Riva. I went out for a short drenching after the drive. It was too horrible to go up any proper mountains, but it's always a joy to ride somewhere new, even if it's not much. The following day was a bit clearer, so I headed up Monte Varagna. This is a little known climb up in the Monte Boldo mountain range. It heads towards Monte Altissimo, but the road eventually deteriorates so you don't quite reach the summit. So on a road bike, it's a 12km dead ender. It averages around 11%, so it's quite a grinder. And as you can see, it's a really narrow road. It has a similar feel to some lanes found in the UK, which gives it an entirely different feel from your typical mountain climb, despite still racking up mountainous elevation gain. For some reason, this makes it easy to forget the magnitude of what you're taking on. For me at least, I sort of got lost in the climb and stopped keeping track of my progress. A nice change from all the popular passes where the Tonante markers scream at you the whole way up. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage from the early slopes saved, but to be honest, there's not a huge amount to see, as you're under tree cover for much of the climb. But there's a few stretches where you get open views down to Lake Garda. There were very few road cyclists up here, although quite a few mountain bikers and e-bikes, and there's a tangle of hiking trails that frequently crisscross over the road. There are a few really steep sections, particularly towards the end, with the last kilometre or two averaging around 14%.
Got one more wall to go. Go on, it's up there.
Despite what it might look like, I actually had a really great time going up here. I wasn't going super hard, but you can't exactly go easy up this kind of climb, so it was still really quite hard. While the quiet, narrow nature of the road makes it a really peaceful and fun climb, I can't say the same for the descent. Temperatures had dropped a lot on the way up, and with all the twists and bumps, you don't want to pick up too much speed going down here, so it was all very slow going. But partway down the descent, I reached this open section which offers great views, and I met another road cyclist who had rented a bike for the day and just ridden up Monte Varagna. So we did the rest of the descent together, and it was really nice to share the enthusiasm of just riding up this awesome mountain. That concludes the Lake Garda intermission. Some great spots and aspects to the area for sure, but I probably won't be rushing back anytime soon. Instead of heading directly back to Predazzo, we took a slightly different route that went via Monte Grappa. There are 10 ways up this mountain, and I chose to start in Simonzo, which is the side they rode up twice in this year's Giro. And it's about 18 kilometers at 8%. At this point, I had decided to give Zoncolan another go the following day, so I didn't want to go too hard, but it's a mountain that I might never get the opportunity to ride again, so still had to ride it properly. I had really heavy legs at the start, but was still able to appreciate the views. Grappa is unique in that it's the only prominent peak around, as it's right on the edge of the Venetian plain. It reminded me of Mount Hamilton in California, or the more obvious one would be Mont Ventoux. If you're thinking, wow, her seat is way too high, you'd be correct. I've been struggling with pedaling comfort since getting new shoes about a year ago, and have been constantly adjusting things, but I've since abandoned my foray into the slam that stem lifestyle and have reverted to a position that many people seem to find offensive. Something you don't often see on hairpin bends or famous climbs is paragliding launch pads. But Monte Grappa is apparently considered the mecca of free flight, and there are a few of these along the way. So if you want a break from two wheels and fancy taking to the air instead, you know where to come. The road surface and gradient is quite irregular, and then there's a notable flat section at around 10 kilometers, after which you start to climb above the tree line. I kept steadily plugging away, enjoying it a lot, even though my heavy legs had now turned into plain old tired legs. In some ways I recognised the climb and surroundings from the Giro, but at the same time it felt like a completely different road. Things look quite different when you see it on TV with crowds and cars everywhere, and also they ride about twice this speed, so it gives you a bit of a walk perspective. I hadn't been pushing it too hard, but this upper section became really difficult. I thought the top was close, and then I'd look up and see another set of hairpins. Since the base of the climb isn't much higher than sea level, you don't really have any effects of altitude to deal with. Somehow it still got really hard to breathe, so it must just have been my imagination. As the landscape grows more open, you get some vast views all around, and a few of the other routes up the mountain join in. In the Giro, they actually took a left down there, so this is where the official Strava segment ends, but if you go right, it keeps climbing up to a military monument. Grappa was the site of quite a few significant events in World War I and II, and this pyramid structure is the largest Italian military ossuary of the First World War. Back to my irrelevant little ride. I struggled around these final bends in a bit of a state. I would have liked to spend more time up there, but these really ominous clouds had rolled in, so I piled on a bunch of clothes and got going. I descended north to Corpo, which was the right direction towards Predazzo. This side had a very different flavour to the one I climbed, very pitchy, twisty and bumpy. Not long after I uploaded this ride to Strava, somebody repeatedly flagged it, which was a bit annoying. It was strange because it's not a particularly sought after segment and it wasn't a particularly great effort, so I don't know why someone was so adamant that it was flag worthy. Strava got round to reinstating it a few weeks later, but yeah, it was kind of sad because I just had a nice ride and someone wiped out all traces of it for a while. But still a great day, and it would be cool to see what the other 8 sides are like. We made it back to our 10-degree mobile home, got a portable heater cranked up, had another pizza dinner, and got ready for the following day's Zoncolan revisitation. Early the next morning we set off to Monte Zoncolan. It's a very scenic drive, but I think my dad was a little sick of all the hairpins at this point. I was feeling super sleepy, but chowed down 2 croissants and cappuccinos, which helped me come to life. This time I started my ride a few kilometers away from the base of the climb, over in Comeglians. Following on from the previous experience, I wanted to get in a bit more warm-up to hopefully shake out some of the fatigue. This quiet lane had some unexpectedly aggressive ramps along it, but it definitely did my legs some good, which were feeling reluctant to get going. Thankfully, it was nowhere near as hot as my first attempt, a bit chilly actually, but I was feeling a lot better as I rolled down to Ovaro. I was super nervous before starting the climb because I knew there was going to be over 40 minutes of immense suffering ahead, and I'd have to go really deep.
Enjoy it.
As for the stats of the climb itself, this is where things are a bit confusing. The official Strava segment is 7.7 kilometers at 14.2%, but if you're riding up from Ovaro, which you most likely would be, you'll have already climbed around 150 meters before reaching this. The first time I rode it, I set off hard right out of Ovaro and was in trouble before even starting the segment. I'm not usually one to pick and choose segments. I like to ride the entire climb hard. But on this attempt, I decided to intentionally ride easier on this first part and then start my proper effort when the main climb actually begins. I needed to PB by a bit over a minute to get the QOM, which would obviously be super hard, but hopefully doable. And I figured that if the ride went well, I'd probably set a decent time on the full climb from Ovaro as well. And when I say that I rode this first part easy, that's just relatively speaking. It was still hard going, but I tried to stay relaxed and ride into it rather than stand up and go crazy, as is often the temptation. This lead-in section is about 1.5 kilometers at 9.5%, and I did this almost 30 seconds slower than my first attempt. I was definitely feeling far better. After this right turn, there's a short flat section, and then you round the bend to quite an intimidating sight. You can see the road kicking up ahead of you, and it doesn't take long before the gradient just hits you hard. Stand up and go crazy, as is often the temptation. I had an 1134 cassette on, which is what I normally use. I tried to stay out of my very lowest gear and kept that in reserves for a few of the steeper pitches that were to come. Instead of riding to power or using live segments or anything, I wrote down a few splits based on my previous attempt and just tried to go a bit faster than that. This was mainly just to give me some sort of distraction and general reference, but I knew it would be obvious quite early on as to whether the effort was going well. Despite having screaming legs and a sky-high heart rate, this ride was already feeling pretty decent, and that's obviously a big motivator. If you can convince yourself it's going okay, then the pain becomes much more tolerable. Versus the first ride up where I felt terrible, paced it terribly, and knew my time wasn't going to be great but still had to plow through. And that's really the main reason I wanted to come back to Zoncolan versus going and doing a new hill. As I said before, it's a climb I'd really wanted to do for a while. Lots of hills in Wales have quite similar percentages but are incomparably shorter. And for me, the longer the better. So being very steep and reasonably long, it's my dream kind of climb. There aren't many noticeable markers along the way, and the video doesn't reflect just how steep it is. But most of the climb is between 14 and 18%. There are a few steeper bits, but never to the extent that it became hard to keep moving, although a bit of zigzagging definitely occurred. There are these roadside markers of famous cyclists, and those, coupled with other signs and monuments, give you a real feeling of Zoncolan's status within the cycling world. Once in the throes of the effort, I stopped worrying about my time and just focused on pushing. It was quite a surreal experience just being in this absolute suffer zone, but moving so incredibly slowly. The road was also very quiet, with very little distracting from the exertion. At one point, I was just wondering what on earth I was doing out on this bizarrely steep road in Italy. No one really around, just wheezing away for the fun of it. I've said it a million times before, but I'm well aware that racers couldn't care less about their segment times because that's not what they're there for. And while I wanted the Zoncolan QM, I also just wanted to prove a point to myself. It's been a strange year of cycling with a lack of tangible goals, so to go out here and just push all that away and do an effort I felt I could be proud of felt really good. Here's a comparison with my previous effort. This is the full segment from Ovaro, so you can see that I started the official segment with a 20-second or so deficit, but then after around 1 kilometer, I started to fairly rapidly cut into that. My dad did drive up Zoncolan, which is probably a worse experience than riding up it. The first time he had gone up and taken a few videos along the way, but all the stopping and starting caused some serious difficulties with the car, and it started making worrying noises on the way down. So this time he set off a while after me and just took it slow. After a little under 6 kilometers, the gradient eases. After so long pushing against something so steep, it almost feels like you're spinning out when it drops to 8%. It felt like I'd suddenly forgotten how to cycle, but this is where you finally get a sense of how high you've climbed. That's my dad just catching me up there, but instead of passing, he just hung back and let me get on with it. And now comes the most dreaded part, the tunnel section. There are 3 tunnels in succession, and while they're not long, they are narrow. They're also pretty bumpy with some loose surface, and it's really disorienting, especially if you're trying to keep the power on. I was convinced I'd punctured because I was just bouncing around and couldn't really see anything. I was also really confused because it seemed way darker than the first time. I thought maybe my vision was closing in like the Zwift pain effect, but I checked my footage and I wasn't hallucinating after all. Presumably the lights are set to be triggered by cars, and the first time there must have been a vehicle that went through not long before me. But that wasn't the case this time, and a cyclist alone isn't enough to turn them on. Once you get out of those tunnels of doom, it's straight back to the steep stuff. I found it hard to get back into a rhythm again, but there was only a few minutes of pain remaining, so I just dug deep and tried to keep pushing. The road's a bit rougher, but there are a few hairpins, and you can see how quickly you're gaining altitude against the gradient. Once you go around this last bend, the summit is right there at the top of the sharp ramp. I managed to put in, well, a really tiny surge, and then slobbered my way past the monument on the right. I had no idea how my time was, so I was pleased to see that I got PB. On the full segment from the very bottom, it was 2 and a bit minutes faster, and on the shorter verified segment, it was more than that, so just under 40 minutes. It was definitely one of the hardest and also one of the messiest climbs I've done, if you know what I mean. Sorry. You can also see how unreliable the weather can be. Despite being 10-15 degrees colder at the base of the climb, the summer temperatures were actually quite similar for my 2 rides. Here's a bit of descent footage which gives you a better idea of how steep it is. As I said earlier, I was really nervous before riding because I felt quite tired and was worried I'd have a terrible ride and essentially waste the day. So I did have a backup plan in case I was way off the pace right away. There's a climb almost directly opposite which is supposedly even harder than Zoncolan, and there's also Monte Grappa nearby, and of course the other side of Zoncolan. So if you're staying nearby, those would be worth a visit. It was quite a long drive back for us, so we had to leave quickly, unfortunately. But we made it back a few hours later and refueled with, yeah, more pizza. With one more day remaining in Italy, I'd tackled all the main climbs I'd set out to, and went for a slightly more relaxed final ride. We'll see about that. We didn't want to travel too far since it was a long old drive back to the UK, but all of the nearby climbs in the Dolomites were still thawing from the storm, and many of the passes were icy, so we headed down to Bolzano. I had fond memories of Bolzano from a brief visit in my childhood, but this time I came to the realization that I just really dislike anything resembling a city. But serving as a gateway to the Dolomites, there are lots of roads that will quickly take you away from the centre and up into quiet vineyards. I chose 2 climbs on this ride. The first was around 9 kilometers at 10% and was just a nice ascent through apple orchards, with very little traffic about. The road surface was a bit variable, especially near the top. Then I descended down the same way.
Yeah, I think that'll be good.
Yeah, okay.
I'll figure out.
It wasn't the nicest of days, as you can see, so it got pretty chilly going down there. And then I manoeuvred back through the confusing centre to get to the next hill, which climbed out the other side of the valley. As you can imagine, I was very tired by this day of the trip, and everything was feeling a bit numb from that long descent, which really enhanced the stupidity that was to come. The start of the climb is tucked away in a residential area, and immediately has you questioning whether attempting it is really a wise idea. The main segment is about 4 kilometers at 15.5%, but that includes a little flat bit in the middle. The first kilometer and a half averaged 17%, half of which averaged 23.5%. Steep climbs are the most enjoyable when they're established roads, but when you're going up something slightly obscure like this that very few people have ridden before, you're never quite sure what the road is going to turn into. So this was somewhat terrifying. I had found this climb the previous evening while I was hastily trying to plan a route by literally googling hardest climb in Bolzano. I guess that riding revered climbs like Zoncolan had given me a little too much confidence, and I thought I could just do a fun little spin up it, but it was only suitable that this final climb perfectly summarised the theme of the trip, which was I should have known better. Because it was real bad. It was definitely the most trouble I've ever been on in a bike in terms of keeping moving. This was mainly due to the fact that my arms and legs just felt all numb and weird after that long descent, and also because I'd severely underestimated it. I would say I learnt my lesson, but I've made this mistake a great many times, and I'll definitely be making it again. This is where I have a confession to make. I stopped. I've been having trouble making it over the grates, and wasn't sure what awaited me around this corner, and I chickened out. And I'm not even embarrassed to admit it. Actually I am, but whatever. It's hard to describe the shell-shocked horror I'd experienced in those first few minutes. One might say I was bamboozled by the Bolzano beast. So I just gathered myself for a second and then got going again. As it turned out, this corner wasn't actually that bad, so it would have been fine. Probably. But the steep gradients went on. And on. And on. I was just trying to get up this thing without pulling too many muscles, because my calf had already twinged in the lower slopes. Eventually it eases, then joins this more major road, but I went venturing off on another cut through. 1.4 kilometers at 16.6%, but rather mild compared to the earlier slopes. And then finally I joined a more normal road again and continued climbing up to 1300 meters. The climb started at 300 or 400 meters, so it turned out to be a reasonably long climb, not in terms of distance, just elevation. This top road was absolutely lovely, so naturally I spent about 2 minutes on it before turning around and descending. This was possibly one of the slowest road rides I've ever done, averaging 17 kilometers an hour thanks to the nice elevation to distance ratio. Unfortunately, someone kept flagging this one too, so no one could see the delightful segments. It's also been resolved now, but it was another weird one because the climbs I did really aren't very popular, and I certainly didn't do them fast. So who knows. But there you go. That was a comical ride, but it was a fun one to end the whole day with. And despite my experience, I'll definitely recommend both climbs, especially now that you know what you're in for. There are loads more climbs out of Bolzano, and it would probably be a good base, especially if you're travelling with non-cyclists but still want to do some cycling. That's a wrap on our holiday in Italy. It perhaps wasn't the most standard way of organising a trip, but I'm really happy with the way it worked out, given that we managed to skirt around the worst of the weather and fit in those 3 goal mountains. As always, a mammoth thanks to my dad for helping me experience these possibly once-in-a-lifetime rides. This trip made me even more aware of the huge wealth of climbs waiting to be ridden, so I really hope I'm able to get back over to Italy someday. But for the time being, we've been plunged back into coldness and darkness, so you know where I'll be for the foreseeable future.